Amara, slender and quiet, dressed in her deep blue uniform with her head wrapped pinned tightly, pushed her cleaning cart past the concierge's desk like she did every morning, eyes lowered, a map of silent awareness stitched into every movement. And as she overheard the confused chatter between the newly arrived French executives and the hotel's translators struggling miserably, she gave no sign, until one of the executives raised his voice and mispronounced a very simple phrase in an almost from. Across the lobby, Lucas Raines, CEO of Aurelian Global and a man known for reading people in seconds, paused mid-stride, eyes narrowing as he watched the interaction unfold with growing interest, tall, sharp-jawed, and dressed in a charcoal coat that cost more than most cars. Lucas had come down unannounced that morning to observe the energy of the building, believing that a company's heartbeat was best felt on the ground floor. But he hadn't expected to see a janitor command a group of foreign delegates with such calm elegance. "Do you know French?" he asked as he approached, half a smile betraying his curiosity. But Mara merely nodded and replied, "Yes, I speak 9 languages," as if it were the most mundane detail in the world. 9 dialects the words hung there. The translator shifted awkwardly. One of the executives said, "She should be running the meeting, not this clown," nodding toward the sweating interpreter. The executives were amused and impressed. Lucas gave Amara a small smile, thanked her, and then left. However, his face had changed, and now there was a glint of curiosity in his eyes. Amara was summoned to the executive floor that afternoon, not at HR or maintenance, but to floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city like gods from Olympus. Her uniform was still on when she entered Lucas's office, and as she stepped onto the clean black tile, her mop bucket left a little water behind. Lucas, who was sitting behind a minimalist desk made of steel and glass, looked up from a printed document with an open expression of fascination. "You said 9 languages," he said without preamble. "List them." She didn't blink. "English, French, Swahili, Arabic, Russian, Mandarin, Spanish, Amharic, and Latin." "Latin?" She stated, "It's not as dead as people think." He sat back and watched her like she was a puzzle that no one had solved. "You don't belong here," he said. She raised her chin, not defiant but proud. "You're not the only one who's told me that." He asked her to translate paragraph 6 on a piece of paper that contained legal jargon from a merger agreement with a French startup. She did so effortlessly and provided additional context regarding a clause that he had not even noticed, something that even his legal team had overlooked. He then gave her a contract from Russia. Documents in Mandarin follow. With each test, her precision stunned him further, not just because she understood the words, but because she understood the nuance, the political undertones, the layered meanings, the way cultures embedded silence between lines. "Where did you learn everything from?" He inquired. She replied, "I used to work in education." "What kind?" She was silent. The air grew heavier. He did not press, but he also didn't let go. Over the next week, Lucas quietly assigned Amara the shadow of visiting international relations director. She wore a new uniform, not a suit, but a smart navy blue dress, and translated during calls, prepped briefing notes, and corrected multiple translation errors in internal memos that could have cost the company millions. People were aware. Admiration was whispered by some, not out of resentment, but rather out of perplexity. How could the janitor suddenly be attending board meetings? Others murmured behind her back. She was said to be having an affair with a powerful individual. Another person thought she was a spy. Lucas, however, knew better. None of the brilliant people he had ever met had carried themselves quite as gracefully as she did. Not with arrogance, but with silence honed into armor. Nonetheless, there were no academic records or work histories in her file prior to 5 years. No LinkedIn, no paper trail. That also gnawed at him. After translating a tense call with a Russian trade partner, Amara stood alone on the balcony of his penthouse office, looking out at the skyline, and he was unable to resist the question any longer. "Why did you run away?" he asked quietly, no edge in his tone, just quiet disbelief. She stared forward. "Because when you're hunted, hiding is surviving." He waited. She did not go into detail. "I found a paper," he said, "on computational linguistics and neural pattern recognition. A female author by the name of Dr. A. Chem. During the briefing yesterday, your phrasing matched it perfectly. Her lips clenched. I had no idea it was still available online. What happened to her? She died, Amara said softly, in a bombing, along with her university, together with everyone who has ever stood by her. Lucas gasped for air. They could hear the city below. So you changed into Amara? She gave a nod. I didn't want to be discovered. I didn't want to be pitted. I just desired silence. Why work here? Because people look through me. That was, for a while, reassuring. He didn't look like a CEO when he looked at her. Instead, he looked like a man who had been hiding behind masks for too long and found something real. You saved that meeting today, he said. You saved the company money, reputation, and, frankly, me from embarrassment. She smiled faintly. I finished my work. He told her, No, you performed more than that. That night, as Amara returned to her small studio apartment, she passed a mirror near her door and looked at herself. Not as a janitor, not as a ghost, but as something in between, something slowly waking up. She didn't take off the headscarf that was draped over her head with her fingers. Not yet. The following day, a memo was sent out announcing that Amara Kim would take over as International Liaison Assistant for all multilingual matters immediately. The janitorial staff blinked in confusion. The office buzzed. The translator she replaced sulked. However, Lucas Raines, sitting in his glass tower, watched her ascent with the calm assurance of a man who had just discovered the most valuable asset of the company. In the one individual that nobody had ever noticed, Amara realized that acceptance was not being offered. Only observation, like she was a rare bird flown into the wrong exhibit. With each hallway she walked that was never meant for her shoes, each hushed glance exchanged in glass conference rooms, and every well-dressed assistant who stumbled mid-sentence at her presence. Lucas Raines had made her visible, but she knew that visibility was not always safety. Visibility invited scrutiny, and scrutiny was a door she had locked for years, despite that she performed flawlessly, as was to be expected. Translating Mandarin calligraphy from a Beijing delegation without taking notes, adjusting a culturally offensive phrase in a proposed Middle East ad campaign, and correcting a legal misinterpretation that nearly cost the company a contract in the car. But the more brilliant she appeared, the more tension she caused. One intern even said she probably just memorized phrases, as if linguistic genius could be forged with flashcards. While Dr. Amara Kim and Amara Kim's names were flashing on his desktop in his late-night office, Lucas couldn't stop thinking about her as a puzzle. The only copy of a 600-page thesis on cognitive patterning through language filtration methods that had once been presented at a securities summit in Warsaw, before the university that hosted it had vanished from a map in the chaos of an anonymous bombing, was named Chem, and he found it buried in a Russian research database that no longer officially existed. He was haunted not only by the paper's brilliance, but also by the fact that some of it matched exactly the language Amara had used casually just days earlier in a strategy meeting. He created a secure folder with the name Shadow Root, out of obsession rather than suspicion, and asked the cyber analyst Danny Salvi to follow Dr. A. Chem. Her record's been wiped clean, Danny reported late one night in Lucas's private lounge, lit by firelight and whiskey. Everything prior to 5 years is a dead end. No passport activity, no social security, no tax filings. How she got hired here, I have no idea. Lucas muttered, I do. She came through the cleaning company of a third party. She was never directly on board, Danny stated. Then whoever buried her past did a flawless job. She didn't just change her name. She was erased by someone. Lucas was leaning forward and tapping his glass with his fingers. She was hiding. From what? Amara, on the other hand, moved gracefully and calmly through the halls like a shadow that had taken shape. However, each night she returned home with an ache in her eyes, the ache of memory trying to rise, because she had buried her past so deeply. Even recalling the tempo of her old lectures felt risky, like opening a tomb. She didn't lie, however, when Lucas confronted her once more, this time in the executive library, holding a printed portion of her thesis and quietly asking, Did you write this? Yes, she replied, but that person doesn't exist anymore. Lucas's response was, She does. She's changing this company, Amara said in a steady but distant voice, until someone decides I don't belong again. Then I'll be nothing again, he said. He tried to read her beneath the surface as he stared at her. You said you taught. Where? Eastern Africa. At St. Rosa University. I taught advanced linguistics and neural theory. I've heard of it, Lucas said slowly. During the revolution, it was bombed. She gave a nod. I was present. I survived. Some did not. Why not start over in your career? Because surviving didn't make me safe. I was mute as a result. The kind of grief that didn't belong to Lucas but demanded to be shared. Something tightened in his chest. You no longer have to run away. I do, she said, stepping away. Because the moment people know I'm more than what I appear, they either want to use me or destroy me. There is rarely a compromise. A scandal nearly proved her wrong the following day. A misfiled internal document linked her name to classified notes from a recent French acquisition deal. Notes she hadn't touched. Within hours, whispers became accusations. Stanton Marsh, a mid-level executive whose ambition was as oily as his handshake, privately suggested to Human Resources that Amara might be here to mine data for a foreign competitor. An emergency board meeting was called. Amara did not attend. However, Lucas maintained his position by pointing out the claim's absurdity and cautioning the board that, if they desired innovation, they could not penalize brilliance disguised as humility. Still, he needed more than instinct. He and Danny looked over the document's metadata that night and discovered a second access trail, Marsh's. He'd edited the metadata to point to Amara's IP. Marsh claimed it was an honest mistake when confronted, but the truth was clear. Amara was seen as a threat by someone because she reminded them of what true ability looked like, not because of anything she had done. Marsh was removed from the project by Lucas. Quietly, discreetly. Amara, when told, didn't gloat. She stated simply, it always occurs eventually. When they don't understand you, they invent a reason to destroy you. However, Lucas noticed something else for the first time in her eyes. Exhaustion, not fear or rage. Amara sat on the floor of her apartment that night, surrounded by scattered pages from her thesis. She had kept copies of them in a box under her sink. Each word had once been written with the conviction that knowledge was sacred and that language was the bridge to peace. Now, all she could think about was whether or not she had lost her voice forever because of survival. She had not, however, vanished. Actually, no. Lucas had discovered her, and now the world was watching. The International Growth Summit, an annual event where billion-dollar partnerships were inked over wine and translation, had begun with pageantry and ego, but behind the applause, the company faced its tightest wire walk in a decade. A $70 million merger with German-French AI firm depended entirely on the next 90 minutes of smooth diplomacy. When the lead interpreter fell ill just hours before, Lucas Raines made the boldest call of his career. He summoned Amara, clad in a tailored black suit borrowed from the executive styling closet, stood at the edge of the stage clutching a sleek wireless microphone. Her posture was composed, but her eyes were fire-forged. Behind her, three of the most linguistically complex delegations, French, Mandarin-speaking Chinese, and German, were all ready to speak across each other with their own agendas, dialects, and expectations that are culturally incompatible. As a room of 200 board members, investors, and international power brokers watched, she took a breath to ground herself, not to calm herself, but to align the cadence of each language like gears in a machine. Amara's translation flowed like music, with her gaze gliding effortlessly between CEOs, adjusting tone and idiom in real time, and capturing not only the words but also the spirit behind them. The first delegation opened in clipped French, thick with legal nuance and hidden conditions. She slipped into the rising tonal structures with such precision that the Chinese representatives were startled into silence, her phrasing not being textbook but native, that a Mandarin rebuttal followed, laced with layered deference and double meanings. She pivoted once more to match their blunt delivery of German, which was structured, direct, intense, and translated into English with just the right amount of firmness. The room held its breath as three cultures clashed gently, and then, through her, began to sink. She clarified legal ambiguities that the original documents had missed, discovered a mistranslation in a clause that would have given the French side too much control over patents, and even cracked a joke in Swahili in the middle of the session to calm the Kenyan investor watching from behind. Amara did not blink when a Chinese delegate questioned her translation at one point. She flawlessly repeated the sentence in Mandarin and Cantonese, then cited footnotes the delegates hadn't expected anyone to remember from an archived transcript of a similar negotiation in 2019. The room froze in that instant. Even Lucas sat forward with the slack jaw of a man witnessing a seismic event, even though he had come to expect brilliance from her. By the time the session ended, the entire negotiation had not only been salvaged, it had evolved into a collaborative draft that all three delegations signed preliminarily, praising Aurelian's unprecedented clarity and linguistic mastery. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause, at first hesitant. As Amara stepped back from the microphone, something shifted, not just in the room, but in her. She stood taller. She didn't shy away from the spotlight. She met it fully, and Lucas, who had watched hundreds of executives rise and fall, knew in that moment. Amara hadn't just translated the deal. She had translated the company into a new era. After the summit, word spread like wildfire. Journalists requested interviews. Her identity was demanded by investors. HR rushed to add her biography to the website, but there was still no official resume. Lucas found her in the executive lounge watching the city lights. This time, he didn't ask her any questions. Instead, he gave her a drink and silently acknowledged that the world now saw what he had seen from the beginning. Amara, on the other hand, broke the silence. She stated, "I wasn't always this. The diplomacy, the languages, people wouldn't listen to me if I didn't learn them. When you aren't allowed to scream, language is your shield." He softly said, "You don't need armor here," as he looked at her. She gave a small, wry smile. "Armor is needed by everyone. You simply conceal it better in a suit." That night, after the celebration, Amara walked alone to her apartment, her phone vibrating non-stop with congratulations and invitations, and stopped in front of a small bookstore. In the window was a copy of a book she once co-authored, years ago, under a name that no longer existed. She didn't go inside. She wasn't required to. She had spoken not just 9 languages tonight for the first time in 5 years, but also her own truth in front of the entire world. And it had listened. The applause from the summit still echoed in the halls of Aurelian Global, but barely a week had passed before the admiration curdled into suspicion, the kind that didn't wear a face but hovered just behind you like a shadow in a tailored suit. Amara, once ignored, was now watched with laser focus, her every keystroke, every corridor conversation, and even the way she held her coffee cup analyzed by colleagues who couldn't decide if she was a miracle or a threat. And in the silence between meetings, rumors began to slither. Why had someone with no formal background appear from nowhere, dazzle foreign investors, and left even the CEO singing her praises? Someone whispered about her laptop always being closed when people passed, about the languages she spoke that no one could verify. And then, quietly, someone leaked her name, Dr. A. Chem, to a reporter at a small but hungry tech blog. Within 48 hours, an article appeared. Janitor turned linguistic star has a hidden past in a war-torn nation. Is she who she claims to be? Amara was depicted not as a survivor, but rather as a possible fraud, a professional ghost who might be manipulating one of the world's most powerful corporations. The story was hazy and was pieced together with bits and pieces from dark corners of the internet. HR was frantic. The board asked for answers. When Lucas returned from a satellite office in Singapore, he discovered that his building was in a quiet crisis, with staff members divided into 2 camps, those who admired Amara and those who feared her. However, the real blow came when Amara's employee ID was watermarked on confidential documents from the French merger that she had helped secure. It was a damning leak. Legal teams acted quickly. Amara was summoned to a hearing behind closed doors with HR, legal, and security. During the meeting, her badge was disabled and she was informed that she was being investigated for malicious disclosure of intellectual property. She didn't weep. She didn't even flinch. She simply said, "That's not possible," and with the poise of someone who had previously been blamed for things and had survived worse. She left the room. Lucas was furious. At the board, at HR, at himself, because the leak reeked of manipulation, and the timing was surgical, arriving just when her influence had peaked. He returned to Danny Salvi, the cyber analyst who had once uncovered Marcia's sabotage, and gave her a simple directive. I want everything. Each login. Each and every access trail. And I need it right away. What Danny found made her sit up straight. The leak hadn't come from a Mars device. It had come from a mirror account, created within the IT department, masked behind administrative privileges. The real leaker was someone with top-tier access. Elliot Grant, the director of European operations, a man who'd stood 2 seats away from Amara during the summit and smiled at her like he was impressed. He had been passed over for promotion 3 times, and the merger Amara had saved would have placed her in his dream position of director of global relations. Even worse, Elliot had already prepared to frame Amara by putting the mirrored files under her ID a few weeks earlier, long before any media coverage had surfaced. Lucas had seen sufficient. That night, without permission from the board, he called an emergency meeting in the rooftop executive lounge, a circular room of frosted glass and sleek silence, and laid out the proof. The faces became pale. Some board members offered weak apologies. Elliot's immediate resignation was demanded by others. However, Lucas found it insufficient. He wanted the company to see what it had almost destroyed. The next morning, he walked into the office at exactly 9 a.m., requested the entire 27th-floor staff gather in the atrium, and within minutes, the elevators were packed with employees whispering theories. When the crowd settled, Lucas stepped forward, not behind a podium, but standing beside Amara, who had been asked to report for an HR update, and looked calmly unbothered despite knowing something had shifted. A week ago, this company almost lost the most brilliant mind it has ever employed. Lucas exclaimed with a raised voice. We almost punished truth and protected deceit, not because of facts, but because of fear. The space froze. He laid out the digital trail in simple language, called Elliot Grant's name publicly, and played a screen recording of the mirrored file path that bore Elliot's login credentials. Then, in front of over 100 staff, Elliot was escorted from the floor by security. The air filled with gasps. But Lucas wasn't finished. He turned to Amara and said, You were doubted, with a calmness that silenced every whisper. Slandered, disrespected, and you never lost your composure. That's not just professionalism. That displays character. Effective today, Amara Kem is not under investigation. Instead, she will be elevated to the position of Director of Global Relations, reporting directly to me. Applause didn't erupt. It burst, spontaneous and fierce, as employees who watched the quiet janitor become a phenomenon finally saw justice bloom. Some cried. The stunned silence of some stood. Amara, on the other hand, remained motionless, her eyes sparkling, and her heart racing as she heard her real name for the first time without fear, shame, or disguise. She nodded once. Lucas gave a retort. She wasn't broken by the world. It had lied to her, framed her, and questioned her. She continued to stand. And now, it would have to answer to her. Amara stood at the head of the glass stage, dressed in a dark emerald suit that caught the lights like silk against storm clouds, her expression composed but utterly unmoved by the spectacle, as if part of her still hadn't stepped fully into the moment, still straddling the invisible line between 2 lives, one built in silence, and the other now carried on the shoulders of an entire corporation that had once erased her presence with the same ease it now. Clapped for her. Amara alone held the room's breath when she stepped up to the microphone, looked out over the sea of investors, executives, journalists, assistants, and interns, and began to speak, not with statistics or market projections, but with a story. Lucas stood behind her off to the side, arms folded and jaw set with something that looked like quiet pride. She began by saying in a calm but firm tone, there was a time when I believed language was a tool to decode the world. That doors would open if you spoke the right words. People would listen. Walls would fall down. I was mistaken. She stopped. Silence. No sneezes. No moving chairs. Language encompasses more than words. Memory is the key. It is survival. It is a form of what people believe they ought to hear from someone who sounds, looks, and or behaves like you or dares to exist in places they didn't expect you to. Behind her, the screen lit up, not with a slideshow, but with a rolling series of her own handwritten notes, glyphs from Mandarin to Arabic to Russian, her quiet maps of meaning. "I've spoken 9 languages in my life," she said, "but I have only recently learned to speak for myself." The audience gasped for air. "I translated a ceasefire agreement between 2 warlords who had killed my uncles when I was 15. I persevered through tears. At 22, I taught a class of linguistics students in a room that had been shelled a week before. I watched everything I had built burn at the age of 29 and became a ghost in a nation that no longer recognized me." As if he were witnessing the weight of what she was carrying, Lucas briefly closed his eyes. "I listened as I mopped these floors. I watched as I cleaned your offices. I was still learning even when I was out of sight." Murmurs rippled softly. She bowed her head. "Now I will speak, not for apology, not for permission, but for progress. Additionally, I will employ all of my language skills to assist this business in advancing into the promised future." Then, one word at a time, in 9 different languages, she said, "Integrity, vision, dignity, memory, courage, truth, tomorrow, peace, respect." With each translation, the screen in the background lit up. The room remained silent. No one moved. No one dared. And then, applause, not the hesitant, polite kind that meetings offers default, but a thunder that started in the back and surged forward, wave after wave, until even the board members were on their feet. Lucas didn't speak. He did not have to, because Amara had done what even he could not. She hadn't just won their admiration. The moral compass of the room had been reset. Her name appeared in every press release from that point forward. In a single quarter, she negotiated 3 additional international partnerships. In interviews, new hires mentioned her. The Chem Fellowship for Cultural Diplomacy was established as a scholarship in her honor. But more than that, the office changed. The security guards at the front desk started saying hello to every janitor, using their names. The cafeteria chef posted a sign in 5 languages, and interns no longer avoided the cleaning staff. They learned from them. On the anniversary of her promotion, Amara walked past the same marble floor where Lucas had first heard her speak French and paused. Just for a second, the light from the windows caught her eyes. A junior associate nearby stopped, confused. "Can I help you, Director?" Amara made a slight turn, grinned, and replied, "No, I was just remembering what the floor sounded like before people knew I was here." The entire office stood still as she passed, not in fear or silence, but out of respect. She carried on with her head held high and her own voice.